July 14th, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The metal lid snapped open with a sharp echoing clang, and every woman in the room stiffened. I stood among them, 12 of us thin as winter branches uniforms hanging loose on our frames, watching a soldier lift a mason jar out of a wooden crate. Morning sunlight poured through the screened windows and caught the jar just right, turning the red inside it into something almost unreal, strawberry jam. For a moment, no one breathed. Not because we wanted it, no wanting had been trained out of us long ago, but because the smell drifted toward us on the humid Texas air like a memory we were not strong enough to face. Sweetness. Real sweetness. The kind we had not tasted in 3 years. Not since Germany had slipped into starvation, not since sugar had vanished into the stomachs of soldiers or the pockets of black market traders. My knees weakened. The absurdity of it, the impossibility of it, hit harder than any interrogation ever had. Back home, children licked beet syrup off spoons and pretended it was jam. Mothers saved the last grains of sugar for Christmas, then cried when even that was gone. In 1944, we Germans were living through our second turnip winter, except this time it wasn't winter. It was every day. Yet, here in a country halfway across the world, a place we had been told was decadent and cruel. An American cook set a jar of jam on a wooden table as casually as if it were nothing more than a Tuesday treat. Behind him, a pot of coffee bubbled. Its smell, rich, warm, unapologetically abundant, washed across the room. I could almost feel the American soldiers relaxing as they inhaled it, the scent they considered ordinary like home. But for us, it was another shock. Coffee had become a ghost in Germany, replaced by roasted barley or acorns or nothing at all. My eyes drifted to the table. Simple pine boards scrubbed clean, metal trays stacked neatly, a steel spoon beside each place. Everything so normal, it became surreal. War had erased the normal world for us, but here the normal world seemed untouched. No one spoke. The American soldier, Corporal Davis Rees learned later, didn't appear to understand why 12 German women were staring at a breakfast spread like it was a live grenade. He reached for another jar, twisting the lid with a grunt. The faint pop echoed through the mess hall. Another wisp of fruit rose. I felt my throat tighten. Back in Germany, factories had collapsed into rubble railroads twisted like broken ribs. Even if a field survived, the bombings' fuel shortages kept tractors idle. 8 million tons of American grain, one of the older women whispered once on the ship crossing. They feed the world, and still their soldiers eat like kings. She wasn't wrong. We had heard rumors of America's bounty, but rumors never prepared you for truth. The United States had produced 96,000 aircraft in the previous year alone, more planes than Germany could dream of, more food than our continent had seen in decades. While our homeland shrank into hunger and fear, America seemed to grow stronger by the hour. Standing in that wooden hall, I felt as though I had walked into another era, one where the world had not yet cracked open. The ceiling fans hummed softly, stirring the heavy July air. A longhorn cattle brand hung on the wall, a proud reminder of Texas life unaffected by the war raging across the ocean. Outside, a truck rumbled past, carrying sacks of flour to the bakery where prisoners made bread for the entire camp. Flour, white flour. Something so rare in Germany that people collected the dust of empty sacks for soup. And now, jam. Jam placed before us like an afterthought. My hands prickled with a strange sensation, not fear, not yet gratitude, but something like vertigo. The world had tilted. Everything I believed felt suddenly weightless. I glanced at the faces of the women around me. Gertrude's lips parted slightly as she stared at the jar, her eyes glassy. Marta clasped her hands tightly, knuckles white. Lotte blinked as if afraid the sight might vanish. We had all seen death, hunger, humiliation, but none of us had seen this kindness wrapped in simplicity. The cook stepped aside, wiping his hands on a towel. "Breakfast is ready, ladies," he said as if speaking to guests rather than prisoners. His voice held no malice, no triumph, just routine, almost neighborly. A strange warmth crept into my chest, unwelcome, unfamiliar. It wasn't happiness. Happiness was too distant a concept. It was something closer to disbelief, a feeling that the world might hold more contradictions than we had been allowed to imagine. I looked down at the spoon in front of me. Smooth, cold steel. Solid. Real. A tool for eating, not surviving. Behind us, a guard refilled his own cup of coffee, humming a tune from the radio. Something bright, American, effortless. The notes drifted across the hall, mingling with the scent of jam. And in that peculiar mixture of smells and sounds, a deeper realization stirred. If this was how America fed their prisoners, what did their soldiers eat? What did their families eat? What kind of country fought a world war and still had enough sweetness left over to give to its enemies? A flicker of shame moved through me, quick but sharp. We had been told America was collapsing under its own excess, that its people were weak, undisciplined, chaotic. Yet, here I stood, a prisoner from a starving nation, staring at a jar of jam so full it seemed almost mocking. I wrapped my fingers around the back of a chair to steady myself. Something profound had cracked open within me, not yet understanding, but the beginning of it. None of us spoke. None of us moved. We simply stood there, stunned, caught between the world we came from and the world we had just stepped into. And the smell of strawberry jam, thick, sweet, impossible, filled the silence. The spoon hovered in my hand, trembling, the ruby smear of jam glistening under the mess hall lights like something dangerous. Behind me, a screen door slammed and the sharp sound shot through my spine like a warning. Every instinct I had learned in Germany whispered the same thing: don't eat it. Don't trust them. Sweetness means danger. The moment of stunned silence from earlier did not fade. It curdled into fear. The longer I stared at the jam, the more my mind filled with the voices of men in gray uniforms lecturing us in bunker classrooms, their words sharp and cold as bayonets. Americans poison food. Prisoners will be tortured, especially women. If they offer sweets, it is only to soften you before punishment. I could hear the propaganda officer now pacing before a chalkboard diagrams of American decadence drawn in white dust. You must resist their tricks, he had told us. The Americans weaponize comfort. They will feed you sugar to break your will. My throat tightened so much I could barely swallow. Was this sweetness a test? A trap? A way to study our reactions, to humiliate us, across the table. Marta's eyes darted around the room as though expecting guards to jump out and force-feed us. Gertrude pressed her palm to her chest, breathing fast like someone caught between hunger and terror. Lotte whispered something under her breath. It sounded like a prayer, or maybe a warning to herself. None of us lifted a spoon. None of us even dared to inhale too deeply. The American soldiers, relaxed and unarmed except for their belts and boots, watched us with puzzled expressions. To them, jam was ordinary, something a mother spread on toast before packing a lunchbox, something a soldier might carry in his pack next to biscuits and cigarettes. The cook scratched his head, confused by the row of frozen German women refusing breakfast. I could feel their bewilderment from across the room. Why are these women scared of jam? They didn't know. How could they? They had grown up in a country where grocery shelves were full, where farms stretched farther than the eye could see, where factories rolled out food as easily as they rolled out tanks and trucks. They didn't know that in Germany by 1944, entire cities were hollowed-out skeletons of brick and smoke. Mothers scavenged beet peels to boil into soup. Schools handed out turnips as rations. Children fainted in bread lines. In some neighborhoods, there were no cats left, not because families adopted them during bombings, but because hunger erased the line between pet and survival. Meanwhile, in America, people still ate white bread. People still spread margarine and jam without rationing the teaspoons. Factories like General Mills and Ford and Heinz weren't collapsing, they were thriving. Posters of Uncle Sam urged citizens to grow victory gardens, and the gardens actually produced enough vegetables to feed towns. Even canned spam, disdained by some, joked about by others, was a luxury millions of Europeans would have fought for. The difference between our world and theirs felt so violent, so enormous, that my mind couldn't reconcile it. Earlier, when the jam jar had been opened, I felt something close to hope. Now, all I felt was the cold grip of conditioning. "What if it's poisoned?" Gertrude whispered. Her words slithered into the space between us, confirming what we were all thinking. "They want us calm before torture," Marta murmured. "That's what they said in France. They soften you first." Lotte shook her head weakly. "It smells too good. It can't be real." But that made it worse. Things that smell good are the most dangerous. They lure you, make you forget caution. That's what we had been taught. My hand clenched around the spoon handle. It was shaking so badly I could hear the faint click as it tapped against the metal tray. Every instinct said survive by refusing. Every atom of hunger said taste it. The clash of fear and longing inside me was almost unbearable. A soldier at the nearest table leaned toward his friend. "Why are they staring at it like that?" His friend shrugged. "Maybe they don't like strawberries." They chuckled lightly, not unkindly, but with the casual ease of men who had never known starvation. Something about their laughter, soft, harmless, tightened the knot in my throat. When had I last heard laughter that wasn't masking misery? When had any of us last lived without flinching at sudden sounds? A fly buzzed over the table and every woman jumped. The guards exchanged glances again, puzzled. I tried to steady my breath, but the memories flooded too fast. The ration cards, the hollow-eyed children, the nights in bomb shelters listening to the world collapse above us, the lines outside bakeries for bread that never arrived, and over everything the fear that the enemy would punish us for losing. I stared at the jam again, not at its color or its smell, but at what it represented, a softness that felt frightening because it was unfamiliar. Why would an enemy give us something so precious? Why waste sweetness on prisoners? Why show mercy when they could show power? None of us had answers. The soldier refilled the coffee pot and the smell drifted over us like a memory from a world we didn't know. Warm kitchens, safe mornings, families intact. It struck me unexpectedly, almost painfully. This was what life looked like in a nation not destroyed by war. This was what peace smelled like. And that somehow made the fear sharper. Because if America was this normal, this abundant, this confident, then everything we had believed, everything we had been taught, might crumble the moment we tasted sweetness. I closed my eyes, gripping the spoon. The metal pressed into my skin, grounding me, reminding me that I was still a prisoner, still a German woman, far from home, still carrying the weight of a collapsing world on my back. And yet, just inches away sat a jar of jam so full and bright it seemed almost unreal. The room felt unbearably still. 12 German women and one impossible choice. Taste and risk believing a lie, or refuse and risk missing a truth. Fear held us in place like a chain, and not one of us lifted a spoon. The tension in the mess hall had grown so dense it felt like another body in the room, breathing beside us, pressing on our chests. Then the soldier nearest the table, Corporal Davis, with a sun-browned skin and eyes far too gentle for war, stepped forward, reached for the jar, and did something so unexpected that every German woman gasped at once. He unscrewed the lid, dipped the spoon straight into the jam, and lifted it to his mouth. Just like that. No hesitation. No theatrics. The soft click of the spoon against his teeth echoed through the hall as if it were the crack of lightning. He swallowed. Calmly. Wiped the edge of the spoon with his thumb, and then holding the jar with both hands as if it were something fragile, something worthy of respect, he extended it toward me. My breath caught. For a moment, all I could do was stare at him, at the impossible softness in his gesture. Warfare had taught us that enemies slapped things into your hands, shoved you, barked orders. Yet here he was offering the jam as though I were human, a guest at his table, someone whose dignity mattered. His voice was soft when he spoke. "Ma'am, it's safe. See." The word "ma'am" made my stomach twist in a way I did not understand. No German soldier had ever called a female auxiliary ma'am, not even our own officers. Slowly, almost reverently, I reached for the jar. My fingers brushed his for the briefest second, and the shock of warmth made me flinch. American warmth. Human warmth. Behind us, a radio crackled to life. Static first, then the bright, playful horns of Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. The melody danced through the mess hall, cheerful and fast, the kind of music girls in America probably listened to while curling their hair or painting their nails. Music that belonged to a country untouched by rubble and hunger. Marta sucked in a breath beside me. The contrast was unbearable. We came from cities whose orchestras had been silenced by bombs, whose concert halls lay in ruins. The only music we had heard for years was the wail of sirens. Now, here was swing music filling the air while a soldier offered us jam. Another scent drifted from the kitchen bacon. Real bacon. The thick-cut kind that crackled on cast-iron skillets and sent curls of smoke into farmhouse ceilings. None of us had smelled bacon since before the war. Germany had slaughtered most of its livestock to keep the army fed. Civilians rarely saw meat. The aroma enveloped us heavy and comforting like a memory of a world that no longer existed. I swallowed hard. My hand trembled so violently the jam inside the jar rippled. I didn't dare taste it yet, but something inside me had already begun to melt, to soften. It was as if his simple act, eating first offering second, had cracked a window in a room sealed shut by fear. Corporal Davis stepped back but stayed near just in case one of us fainted again, I suppose. His uniform looked freshly laundered, the khaki crisp and unwrinkled, the seams straight. No patches, no frayed threads. Even his boots gleamed. American abundance was stitched into the very fabric of their clothes. I noticed his belt, neck sturdy, polished with a steel buckle engraved with U.S. Once such a symbol might have made me stiffen in defiance. Now it only bewildered me. How could men so powerful behave with such gentleness? Behind him, a cook dragged a metal case across the counter, one of those heavy, steel-paneled boxes that Americans seem to produce endlessly. Its latches clanged open, revealing neatly organized rows of utensils. Shiny, untarnished, uniform in shape and size, industrial perfection. In Germany, we were lucky if we found 2 matching spoons in the same barracks. The cook pulled out a ladle, then a tray of eggs, humming along with the radio. He moved like a man who had never known scarcity, never had to stretch a handful of ingredients into a meal for 10. Even the way he cracked an egg seemed casual, effortless, rooted in a lifetime of plenty. I looked around the room again, truly looking this time. The ceiling fans, the polished floorboards, the steady rhythm of American boots on the ground. This was not a land gasping for survival. This was a land of confidence, of competence, of a prosperity untouched by war. And suddenly, the fear that had paralyzed us began to shift into something more complicated, something bruised and trembling but undeniably alive. Hope. Gertrude leaned toward me, whispering in German, "Why is he being kind? What does he want?" Her voice carried confusion, suspicion, and a desperate craving for explanation. Before I could respond, Davis glanced in our direction again. He seemed to sense the fear in our shoulders, the stiffness in our posture. Instead of crowding us or insisting we eat, he simply nodded, a gentle, steadying gesture as if to say, "Take your time. I'm not here to hurt you." It disarmed me more than any command could have. Lotta wiped at her eyes. "I don't understand," she whispered. "They treat us better than our own officers did." Her words struck me harder than she intended. It was true. Our officers fed themselves first. Our officers shouted. Our officers punished weakness. But these Americans, they fed us bacon before eating it themselves. They offered sweetness without expecting submission. They treated us not as defeated enemies, but as women who had suffered enough. I felt something warm build in my chest, not gratitude yet, but the first faint rumblings of it. The kind that grows slowly like embers under ash. The cook called out fresh eggs coming up, and the clang of the skillet hitting the stovetop made 3 of us jump. Davis raised a hand in apology, gesturing that it was just normal kitchen noise, nothing more. Normal kitchen noise. In Germany, loud metal usually meant bombs or collapsing buildings. Marta dabbed her forehead. How can they live like this when the world is burning? But that was the thing, we were the ones burning. They were the ones holding the hose. Still, I hesitated, spoon hovering again, afraid of what tasting the jam might mean, because kindness is frightening when you have lived too long without it. Kindness demands vulnerability. Kindness asks you to believe in something beyond survival, and yet... The soldier's gesture replayed in my mind. Over and over, he had eaten first. He had offered with both hands. He had waited patiently, respectfully. We were their prisoners, but in that moment he behaved like we were under their protection. My chest ached with a strange heaviness. Something inside me, some small, guarded part, was collapsing under the weight of unexpected mercy. Marta nudged me gently. "Hilda, maybe this is real." Her voice shook. So did mine when I answered, "I don't know." But deep down, beneath the fear and exhaustion, beneath the memories of bombed streets and ration queues and nights spent trembling underground, something fragile began to unfurl. Maybe kindness wasn't a trick. Maybe sweetness wasn't a weapon. Maybe the enemy wasn't made of monsters. And, as the radio music swelled horns bright and playful and the smell of bacon seeped deeper into the room, I felt the first genuine crack in the wall I had spent years building around my heart. The Americans weren't breaking us. They were showing us something else entirely, a way of being human that our world had forgotten, and I didn't know whether to fear it or fall to my knees in gratitude. The moment my spoon finally touched the surface of the jam, the mess hall seemed to exhale. Even the ceiling fans felt suddenly louder, spinning above us like anxious witnesses. I lifted the spoon toward my lips, my hand trembling so violently I feared I might drop it. Around me, 12 women leaned forward, not urging me, not stopping me, but holding their breath as if my choice would decide all of ours. The sweetness hit before the taste. Just the scent brushing my tongue sent a shock through my body as if my nerves had forgotten how to process anything but salt and hunger and ash. The jam touched my lips, soft, cool, impossibly rich, and the world went still. Then the flavor bloomed. Strawberry. Real strawberry. Sun-warm, sugar-sweet, bursting with a richness so foreign to my starved senses that for a moment I felt dizzy. My eyes fluttered shut, and then everything inside me broke. The first tear fell without warning, hot against my cheek. Then another. Within seconds, my vision blurred completely, the room dissolving into watery shapes and colors. I wasn't in Texas anymore. I was 8 years old again, sitting at our kitchen table in Hamburg, watching my mother spread strawberry jam on Sunday bread. She hummed while she worked a soft melody that drifted through the house like sunlight. My father would ruffle my hair. My brother would steal the crust off my plate. I would laugh. We all would. That world was gone long before I was captured. Bombed. Crushed. Buried. And yet, one spoonful of jam, one impossible taste of sweetness dug it out of the rubble so vividly it felt like the ghosts of my family were sitting in the empty chairs beside me. My shoulders collapsed inward. A sob tore from my chest, loud, raw, unrestrained. The kind of sound a person makes only when something long frozen finally thaws. Gertrude gasped. Hilda. But she didn't finish her question, because then she tasted it. Her face crumpled instantly, and she let out a choked cry. Marta followed, then Lotta, then the women down the table one by one in a slow, devastating wave. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't dignified. It was the sound of starving women remembering they were human. Within moments, the entire table dissolved into tears. Hands shook. Shoulders trembled. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else covered her face and slid out of her chair, sinking to her knees as if the sweetness itself had become a kind of holy revelation. I felt a hand grip mine. Lotta's fingers cold and desperate. Her voice cracked. I thought I would never taste this again. I squeezed back, unable to speak. Across from us, Marta pressed her forehead to the wooden table, sobbing into her palms. My mother used to make jam, she whispered. Before the bombings, before everything. Her voice splintered. She covered her mouth as if afraid of the sound escaping her. It was as though we had all been pulled backward through time, dragged through the ruins of our memories by one spoonful of fruit and sugar. Each of us had lost someone. Each of us had lost a home. And in that moment the jam tasted like all of those losses and all of the life that came before them. To the American soldiers standing nearby, it must have looked like madness. One private lowered his coffee cup slowly. What's happening? Another stared bewildered. It's just jam, isn't it? Corporal Davis stepped closer but didn't try to intervene. His eyes softened as he watched us, though confusion still flickered behind them. He had grown up in a world where sweetness was part of daily life, not a miracle. He didn't know what had been taken from us. But the American people watching this scene decades later, they would understand. Because this wasn't about jam. It wasn't about food at all. It was about what sweetness represented. The return of something we thought we had lost forever. Humanity, hope. The ability to feel anything other than fear. More women crumbled. Some held hands. Some covered their hearts. Some whispered the names of loved ones who never survived the war. The mess hall fell silent except for the sound of German women crying over a jar of jam. Even the radio seemed to hush the lively swing music, fading into background static as if the world itself was giving us space to break. I wiped my eyes, breath shaking violently. The sweetness still lingered on my tongue, delicate and cruel in its beauty. I brought the spoon to my lips again, slower this time, letting the taste spread through me like warmth in cold bones. It hurt. God, it hurt so much to remember happiness, but it also healed. Corporal Davis finally spoke, his voice quiet. Ma'am? Are you all right? He meant it sincerely. He meant it in a way that made another tear slip down my cheek. I forced myself to look up at him. His posture wasn't rigid like the officers we had known. His eyes weren't hard. He stood there with his hands slightly raised as if approaching a wounded animal, not an enemy soldier. In that moment, he seemed to realize this was not hunger, not weakness, not manipulation. This was grief mixing with gratitude in a way words could never express. Behind him, other Americans watched with stunned silence. They didn't know that a spoonful of jam could be the difference between life and despair, but their grandparents would have known. Their great-grandparents, the soldiers, farmers, and homemakers of the greatest generation, understood what it meant to offer sweetness in a world filled with bitterness. To them, this scene would become a point of pride. This is who we were. This is what America did even for its enemies. If the children and grandchildren of those soldiers watched it today, many would whisper the same thing. Without that kindness, my grandfather might not have come home. This is why I'm proud to be American. The tears would not stop. On my left, one woman pressed her hands together and whispered a trembling prayer of thanks not to God, not to Germany, but to the simple mercy of strangers. Another woman, Elise, usually stoic and cold, broke entirely. She cradled the jam jar against her chest like a relic, as if warmth could be absorbed through the glass. Her voice cracked as she murmured, I forgot what it meant to feel. I touched my cheek, shocked to find it wet again. And in that flood of emotion, one truth rose above all others: the Americans had not given us sweetness. They had given us back our humanity. The jam was only the spark. The real miracle was what it awakened. We cried because for the first time in years we remembered we were still alive. When the tears finally slowed and the last trembling breath faded into a fragile quiet, something shifted inside me, something small but unmistakable. It was as if the sweetness had unlocked a door I didn't know existed, and behind it lay a truth I had been trained all my life not to see. I wasn't afraid of the jam anymore. I was afraid of what it meant. For the first time since my capture, I allowed myself to look at the Americans not as faceless enemies, but as men. Young, tired, sunburned, smelling faintly of soap and coffee. Human beings. And what I saw in their faces was not hatred, not triumph, not cruelty. It was concern. Corporal Davis approached again, gentle as ever. Ma'am, do you need water? The way he said ma'am still startled me. Soft, respectful, so different from the clipped commands of German officers. Before I could answer, he set a canteen on the table beside me and stepped back, giving me space. Giving me dignity. No lecture, no mockery, no punishment for crying. Such a small gesture. Such an enormous revelation. Because if what we had been taught were true, if Americans were the savage monsters in Nazi posters, then this moment should not have been possible. This kindness should not exist. But it did. And suddenly, I felt the ground I stood on tilt. The world was no longer divided neatly into Deutschland and Feind. Something more complicated, more dangerous was forming understanding. That evening, I found myself unable to sleep. The barracks were quiet except for the occasional rustle of thin blankets and the soft sighs of exhausted women. Moonlight crept through the slats in the wall, striping the floor in pale silver. My hands still smelled faintly of strawberries. I reached for the small notebook I kept hidden beneath my mattress, the one object I had managed to save when our position collapsed in France. Opening it, I wrote slowly, the words forming before I fully understood them. America fights with steel. Yes, but even more with mercy. The sentence startled me. But it felt true in a way nothing had felt true in a long time. In Germany, the world was collapsing. We all knew it even before we admitted it. Cities bombed to dust. Factories idle. Rations shrinking until there was nothing left to ration. Propaganda tightening around us like a fist, squeezing out independent thought, turning fear into obedience. We had lived through a winter where turnips were the only food for weeks. A winter where even those turnips grew scarce. A winter where children looked like old men, and old men looked like ghosts. Everything was disappearing: food, safety, hope. And yet, across the ocean, America was thriving. Freedom of the press meant that people weren't afraid to question their leaders. Factories churned day and night, their smokestacks promising strength instead of ruin. Fields of wheat waved under the summer sun, tended by men and women who believed the war would end in a better world, not a bleaker one. Neighbors helped one another. Communities grew victory gardens. Families sent sons to war and still managed to gather around dinner tables laden with food. Abundance wasn't the only difference. It was the spirit behind it. Germany had survived by tightening its grip. America survived by opening its hand. The next morning, we walked to the labor truck that would take us to the cotton fields. The air smelled of dew soil and something warm drifting from the kitchen pancakes, maybe. Or biscuits. Things I had forgotten existed as everyday foods. 2 American guards leaned against the truck, chatting casually about baseball, another reminder that life here continued without war crushing its spine. When they noticed us, they straightened respectfully. Not one of them looked at us with disgust. Not one of them looked at us with triumph. They simply nodded as if greeting coworkers rather than prisoners. Something inside me softened again. As we climbed onto the truck bed, Marta whispered, "Do you think they hate us less today because we cried?" I considered this. "No," I said quietly. "I think they never hated us at all." The thought was terrifying and liberating, because if they didn't hate us, then perhaps we didn't have to hate them. Later that afternoon, while tying bundles of cotton, I saw Corporal Davis kneeling beside an injured prisoner, a woman from Berlin who had twisted her ankle. He spoke to her gently, testing her foot, then lifted her in his arms and carried her to the truck. She clung to him out of necessity, but he carried her out of compassion. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a farm boy trying to help a neighbor. Watching him, something inside me snapped into clarity. Kindness is not weakness. Kindness is power of a different kind, the power to end the war inside a person's heart before the actual war ends. I suddenly understood why America was winning, not only because of machines or factories or endless supplies, but because the people here believed in something bigger than victory, something stronger than fear, mercy. Years later, Americans watching this moment would see something else, something deeply personal, deeply national. A mirror of who they once were. A reminder of who they still could be. A country united. A people who believed morality mattered. A generation that carried both rifles and compassion with equal conviction. Modern viewers would feel a sting of nostalgia. We used to be like this. We used to stand together. We used to lead with decency. Some would whisper, "This is the America my father fought for." Others, "We were the light of the world." Once, maybe we can be again. But for me in 1944, sitting in the back of that truck with cotton dust on my hands and the taste of strawberry still lingering on my tongue, the revelation was simpler, quieter, but no less profound. The Americans had not broken us with cruelty. They had disarmed us with humanity, and the war inside me, the war of propaganda, fear, pride, and hate began to collapse under the gentlest of weapons. A spoonful of jam. Years later, long after the war ended and the fences of Camp Hearn were torn down or left to rust under the Texas sun, I would still wake in the middle of the night with the taste of strawberries on my tongue. Not because the memory was painful, though it was, but because that single moment of mercy had rerouted the course of my life. And I wasn't the only one it changed. When repatriation came in 1946, I stepped off the ship into a Germany I barely recognized. My childhood street was a skeleton of broken brick. The bakery where my mother once bought flour stood as a burned-out shell. The air tasted of soot and resignation. Hunger still stalked the cities, lingering like a winter that refused to end. People saw my American-issued coat and asked questions in hushed voices. "What was it like? Did they beat you? Did you starve?" I shook my head. How could I explain it? How could I make them understand that the place where I had expected suffering had given me back the ability to feel? For months, I tried to bury the memory of the jam. It was too bright, too gentle, too alive to fit inside the harsh grayness of post-war Germany. But stories have a way of resurfacing, especially the ones that change you. The first time I told the full story, I was sitting at my sister's kitchen table in 1951. Her son, my nephew, had asked me what America was really like. He was 6 years old, wide-eyed, his elbows on the table as he waited for my answer. I didn't start with victory or defeat. I didn't start with tanks or battles. I started with the jam. I told him about the soldier who tasted it first to ease our fear. I told him about the music on the radio, the smell of bacon, the crisp uniform. I told him how my tears surprised even me, how the other women broke around me like ice, giving way under spring thaw. How a mess hall in Texas became the unlikeliest place for a wounded heart to heal. His small eyebrows knitted together. Why did they give you jam? I smiled softly, running my fingers along the table's edge. Because they believed kindness mattered, I said, even toward their enemies. That story became the one he asked for every winter, especially during the lean years when sugar was still rationed in our little town. Tante Hilda, he would say, tugging at my skirt. Tell me about the Americans and the strawberry jam. As he grew older, he began repeating it to his schoolmates. By the time he had children of his own, it had become a family legend, our improbable reminder that mercy can appear in the places we fear most. And when I grew old and fragile and the winters felt longer, my grandchildren would sit at my feet and ask for it too. Tell us about the sweetness in the prison camp, they said. And I did. Every time. But I wasn't the only one whose life bent around that moment. Corporal Davis, the young American with the gentle eyes, returned home after the war to his family's farm in Oklahoma. For a long time, he didn't speak much about the war. When he did, it wasn't the gunfire he recalled or the marches or the nights sleeping under foreign skies. It was the morning 12 German women began crying over a jar of jam. To his friend, he admitted once, "It made me realize something. Kindness is also a weapon, perhaps the strongest. You can break a man with cruelty, but you can change him with mercy." He married a teacher, raised 3 daughters, and built a small woodworking shop behind the barn. And on the wall above his workbench, nailed to a board of sanded walnut, he kept a single silver spoon, the same kind issued by Camp Hearn. He never explained why. He didn't need to. His daughters would later say, "Daddy always told us that treating people right matters most when the world tells you it doesn't." Decades later, when our story finally found its way into American documentaries and history books, something unexpected happened. American viewers, men and women who had grown up hearing only the triumphs of the war, began writing letters. Some wrote, "My granddaddy guarded POWs in Texas. He always said they deserved dignity. Thank you for confirming his stories." Others wrote, "My family was German. If not for American camps, my great-grandmother might not have survived. We are alive because of your kindness." And many more wrote something like this: "I wish America today could be like America back then, united, fair, and full of heart." Watching the comments and hearing the interviews, it dawned on me that the story was no longer mine alone. People asked me, "What changed you? When did the war inside you end?" I never spoke of the day Germany surrendered, or the moment I stepped off the ship back home. I told them it ended in a Texas mess hall at a simple wooden table with sweetness on my tongue and tears in my eyes. Because that was the moment I understood something no propaganda could ever teach, something no military leader would ever dare admit. Not every enemy hates you. Not every opponent wishes you harm. And sometimes kindness is the most powerful force on a battlefield. When I think of America now, I don't think of uniforms or rifles or factories. I think of that morning, the radio humming a cheerful tune, the smell of bacon, the cool steel of a spoon in my shaking hand. And I think of what that moment revealed about the country that held me captive. What made America great was not its power, it was its mercy. Mercy shown not in grand displays but in small choices, in treating prisoners with dignity, in feeding enemies well when the world was starving, in believing that decency should never be surrendered even in wartime. These were the values of the greatest generation, not because they won the war with superior weapons, but because they refused to abandon humanity while doing it. As I share this story now, decades later, I know it is more than history. It is a mirror held up to those who inherit the legacy of that era, a mirror asking a question that only Americans can answer. This is the America you came from. Do you still honor it? Do you still believe in mercy? Do you still believe in dignity? Do you still believe that strength and compassion can coexist? Because the world remembers the America that fed its prisoners better than many nations fed their own citizens. The America that kept its moral compass steady even as the world burned. My story is not a political plea, nor a nostalgic fantasy. It is a reminder, a quiet, stubborn reminder that greatness rooted in humanity never fades, and that the smallest gesture can become the longest echo through time. As my life neared its final chapter, my granddaughter brought me the old notebook I had carried from camp to camp, belonged to everyone who needed proof that humanity could survive even in the darkest of times. People weren't just nostalgic for victory. They were nostalgic for virtue. For the time when the country believed in mercy as fiercely as it believed in strength. They said, "We were the light of the world once. Maybe we can be again." And hearing that, I felt the old warmth in my chest, faint but steady. In my twilight years, when my hands shook and my vision faded, I asked my granddaughter to bring me my notebook, the same one I had written in on that moonlit night in Texas. Its pages were worn edges soft as cloth. On the first page in my younger handwriting, the words still glowed with quiet truth. America fights with steel, yes, but even more with mercy. She read it aloud, her voice thick with emotion. Then she kissed my forehead and whispered, "Oma, I'm glad someone showed you kindness when the world did not." I smiled, closing my eyes, and the jam had been sweet, and the war had been bitter, but the memory, the mercy was what endured. It lived in my children, in my grandchildren, in every person who ever heard the story and felt something stir inside them, and as long as they remembered it, the kindness of that moment of those Americans would never die. In the last years of my life, when memory softened around the edges and the world grew quiet enough for reflection, I found myself returning again and again to that single morning in Texas, one moment, one spoonful, one impossible sweetness that outlived the war itself. It haunted me, not because it was painful, but because it revealed a truth so simple, so disarming, that I needed nearly a lifetime to understand it fully. I came to realize that what happened in that mess hall was never really about jam. It wasn't about food or hunger or the contrast between nations, though those things shaped the moment. What happened at that wooden table with the sound of swing music drifting through the dusty air and sunlight glinting off a mason jar was something deeper. It was the return of humanity. Not victory, not defeat, not ideology, but the fragile, stubborn spark that survives even when the world has tried its hardest to extinguish it. That single spoonful of jam reminded me, no, it taught me that humanity cannot be bombed out of existence, starved into silence, or imprisoned behind fences. It endures, quietly, patiently, waiting for the smallest kindness to awaken it again. For me, that awakening came from an unexpected place, a young American soldier who saw frightened enemy women and chose compassion over suspicion. His gesture was small, almost invisible within the enormity of the war. But sometimes, the smallest acts echo the loudest. A spoonful of jam, a respectful word, a gentleness offered in a violent world, and somehow they mattered more than the armies that marched or the nations that clashed. Years later, when across the ocean, across the ruins of post-war Germany, and into the decades of peace that followed. Its cover was cracked, its pages yellowed, but inside, barely legible beneath the faded pencil strokes, was the line I wrote in that barracks the night after the jam: "America fights with steel, yes, but even more with mercy." On the next page, time had left its own mark. A faint, reddish stain, almost invisible, unless the light struck it just right, the residue of a strawberry jam pressed between paper and memory. That stain survived longer than the war, longer than the walls of Camp Hearn, longer than many of the men and women who lived through those years. It survived because kindness leaves marks that history cannot erase. My granddaughter traced the stain with her fingertip, then whispered, "Oma, is this really from the jam?" I nodded, feeling tears warm my eyes. Yes, that was the day I first tasted freedom. She smiled, soft, reverent, and closed the notebook gently as if protecting something sacred. And in that moment, I understood why the story still mattered. Why it continues to matter. Why it always will. Because wars end. Nations change. Generations rise and fall. But humanity, the real kind, the kind offered freely even to enemy hands, lives forever in the stories we choose to remember. And this one, my story, belongs not only to me, but to the America that chose mercy when the world needed it most,